If you're watching this, you probably love hearing people talk about books. That's the essence of what BookTube is. A bunch of strangers gather up online and we share how we feel about what it is that we're reading. And it can be nice to take something as private and intimate as reading, of having the author's thoughts ringing through your mind as if they're your own, and then hearing how someone else can take those same words from the text and interpret it in an entirely different way. It's almost a reminder of how differently we can see the same thing, even though on the surface it seems so obvious how to interpret it one way. The layers of meaning are so much deeper than maybe our eyes can immediately discern. And it's refreshing too, to just have that communication about what is otherwise so quiet on the page. And if you're of that sort, to enjoy conversations about books, the ways that books can be so mysterious in spite of the fact that they're always telling and telling, then I hope that the books that I share with you today in this video will illuminate text even further. There are a lot of different ways to talk about literature, and all of us have learned in our English classes the ways to analyze and illuminate text with evidence and then commentary following. And that commentary is often just finding the subtext, the little under layers of what's there. And in some cases, what you're doing is you're not merely discovering meaning, you're using the text as an illustration of meaning of your own sort. And that's why there can be so many ways to take any one text and squeeze out some sustenance from it, because so much of that squeezing is you using the text as a scaffold for your own thinking. And that is certainly one way to go about it. But with the books that I'm going to show today, I want to focus on looking at what it is that the author is doing in a work, in the sense of how is that work reflecting the world that they're in, or how is that work taking our instincts for narrative and utilizing those instincts in order to accomplish greater ends. How is the author orchestrating all the myriad ways of interpretation to try and get the reader to see things a certain way? So the books that I'm going to be showing are going to be books about books. They're going to be books about the history of reading, and they're also going to be books about the psychology of certain characters. There are various types of characters that repeat, and so too various types of storytelling. These books are just going to be the author, just like a booktuber, sharing their way through the literature, not merely giving their interpretation of the underlying meaning of each individual piece, but rather trying to show what is that literature revealing to us about stories generally. It's also going to connect with the activity of reading itself, that mysterious thing that we do for hours and hours at a time. And some of these books are a reflection as much on that process as they are a reflection on what's being said in the text itself. So I hope that there's a nice range of books here. All of these aren't telling you how to read, and it's important to keep that in mind. You already know how to read. You're doing just fine. These books are just addendums to your reading. You can think of them as like containers of thinking, where you can drop your own thoughts thus far into that little container, shake it up, and it might give you some different colors and mixtures that you didn't otherwise think of. It should be seen that way, of taking what was already whole with the text and just cutting it up in a different fashion. And you should not adhere too strongly to any one method of interpretation. What you're getting instead is possible ways of delineating and interpreting the text. And it's important to remember that. These books are just like every booktuber that you watch. It's just ways into the text, ways to think about it. It's sharing with you what seemingly is of value in every work that you read. It's not telling you what to think. It's just giving you additional tools of thinking through what it is that you read. The first book I want to cover is related to the rhetoric of fiction. And that word rhetoric typically is associated with giving speeches and having a goal in mind. When you deliver a speech or you write an essay to someone, you're trying to convince them of something. So you have some end in mind. What you're really doing is you're trying to hold someone's hand and pull them along toward that same end with you, such that they could be persuaded to your side of things. And it's that moving them from wherever they are to where you are that requires quite a bit of balance and work. And that's where that term rhetoric comes in. And so when we think of the rhetoric of fiction, what we're thinking about is how stories also have ends. There is a goal that the author has in mind, and that could be merely an emotional effect, or it could be to help you see aspects of the world in a different way. Because there is still an end goal in mind, there are still various tricks that the author can partake in order to hold your hand as the reader in a nice enough way. So fittingly, the first book I want to cover in this video is The Rhetoric of Fiction by Wayne C. Booth. And it has the word "the" as if it is the authority on a single rhetoric of writing fiction. But as Wayne C. Booth says in the afterword, in some ways it would have been better to call it a rhetoric of fiction, because there are many ways to discuss how fiction becomes as persuasive as it does. And this is just one way into that mode. But what works so well about this book, and the reason why I want to mention it to you today, is it orients itself in contrast to assumptions that we make about what good writing is supposed to be. It opens with an argument against a phrase that you've probably heard many times: show, don't tell. And that phrase is supposed to be advice for writers to make sure that they are just delivering the sense experience and the action of the story, as opposed to just directly, literally communicating what the reader is supposed to feel or think about something. It's sort of assumes an objective frame that the reader can then interpret themselves. And this author in The Rhetoric of Fiction makes an argument against that being such a prime form of advice in writing. He tries to make a defense of telling in literature. And part of the backdrop for why he feels it's necessary to defend that mode of telling as an option in one's writing is he's trying to get us to think carefully about the effectiveness of an author and the authority that authorship carries, and how, as an author in writing, you have opportunities always to consider the relationship that you're building with the reader. Because readers, as soon as they enter into a story, there's a kind of agreement of trust that they have with you, the writer. And in that agreement of trust, there is an openness to the tale that you're attempting to tell and the mode that you're attempting to set. And an author can undercut that by perhaps not controlling the frame of the story enough. And this author gives all sorts of examples of how authors can control the story, can control the implied authorship that builds throughout a long narrative. And it's written for writers and readers equally. It's something where you can think about how to write a story by thinking about the tools that he's communicating that a writer can have. But as a reader, you can also start to notice those tools in action, the ways that there is this kind of view of a writer in mind as you're reading a text. There is this narrative voice that remains consistent as it goes along. And there also is a benefit to having these opportunities of telling directly, not leaving things open for interpretation. There's room for interpretation in spots, but there's also room for some pointedness in literature. And there's a bit of defense of pointedness, defense away from merely subtext stacking in writing, and sometimes choosing to be direct when that directness avoids confusion and or allows for a certain degree of efficiency. In some ways, The Rhetoric of Fiction is a reminder of the opportunities that one has to be efficient in communicating a story. That stories don't always need to drag, although there is a place for dragging something out and elongating the experience and accumulating memory, in essence. There's also a place for engaging with a certain immediacy in the storyline itself. It ends up being a reminder of the constant negotiation that's happening between every writer and every reader. And just like the next book that I'm going to discuss, it's also a reminder of the perspective that's always at play in a narration. The next book that I'm thinking of is Narrative Discourse by Gerard Genet. And this one's a more structuralist and academic angle on thinking about what's contained in literature. Just like how The Rhetoric of Fiction focuses on the authority of authorship, Narrative Discourse focuses on the focalization of a narrative voice. Certain details rising up while others drown deeper down into the depths. It's that subjectivity in the narrative voice. Gerard Genet includes that within his 5 categories of breaking up literature. He breaks it up by order, duration, frequency, voice, and mood. And the mood is wherein he contains this notion of focalized authorship, of, for instance, a child character being limited to the understanding of a child, such that you, the reader, you can't rely on their interpretations of the world. You have to infer quite a bit more on top of that. Or how the order of narration can create a distinction between the chronology of what's happening. There's a lot of control beyond just presenting the story step by step by step in the order of events. You get to control the experience of those events, and that also controls the frame by which we are receiving those events, or frequency, the use of repeating motifs, and how when an image or an aspect of tone, an emotional register repeats and repeats and repeats, it also then becomes emphasized in a different sort of way. And so that I could go on about Gerard Genet's points, but I want to bring up Gerard Genet's book because he uses the example of Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time throughout. That's sort of his main illustrative text. And I know that a lot of people are reading In Search of Lost Time right now because there is a read-along with Another Bibliophile Reads of that series of books, and I'm also reading the books for that reason. And so if you yourself are part of that read-along and you're reading Marcel Proust, just know that Narrative Discourse by Gerard Genet uses that book as a means of communicating a lot of the frameworks at play in narrative discourse itself, in the narrative structure of storytelling. If you had to just get one of these books about literature, I would have it be The Cambridge Introduction to Narrative. The reason being, even though it's quite slim and it is essentially a textbook, it covers the gamut of ways of interpreting narrative and understanding it. And it goes beyond narrative just in literature, but into all forms of narrative in film or video games or even in our interpretations of art. And because it is viewing narrative as a psychological phenomena that manifests itself again and again, it is really communicating, by and large, the formulations of narrative that we take upon ourselves day in and day out regularly. It frames the structure of narrative as something that we incorporate unconsciously and habitually. Via that incorporation, it becomes a means of us divvying up the time that we experience in memory, and also becomes the framework by which we understand the world. And so because so much of how we take in the world is through connecting relationships between events or between ideas or between people, and that becomes how we hone our memory. Because imagine if you were to memorize every single detail of what happens, that would be highly inefficient for memory. It is far better for memory to organize things in a relational way. And of course, that relationship is a stacking of interpretations, and there's different ways to view that same experience. And so narrative becomes the essence of how we experience everything. And since this book is taking this broad view of narrative and trying to understand how it occurs repeatedly across various mediums, it feels to me like the perfect crash course of this field of narratology, trying to take seriously the idea that narrative permeates so much of our experiences, if not all of our experiences of the world. And despite the fact that it is a textbook, it's written really smoothly and nicely. It's very readable. It's dense with ideas, and it's not telling you just one way to view narrative. It's really gathering up the ways that various writers have been thinking through narrative structures. And so you're going to be hearing about different ways of viewing time in narrative, different ways of viewing narrative jamming, which is where the dissatisfaction of a story not quite manifesting in the way you expect, or even the lack of coherence in a story, the effect that that can have on a reader or a viewer. You're going to hear about the borderlines on the edge of narratives, the ways that there can be frame tales in and out of different perspectives. You're going to hear about focalization. You're going to hear about all of these different techniques just crammed together, and it's going to help you think not just through stories and literature, but stories of all kinds. It even gets a little bit into interactive storytelling, like video games. Because of course it's easy to take for granted that video games have stories, but it is quite a different way to tell a story, to have the player actually interacting and in control, veering in different directions within a narrative. And that quite limits what narrative can do. And in many ways, video games are trapped trying to be like films. And so because they're trying to be like films, they use all of these filmic techniques, but the medium itself doesn't lend itself well to that linear style of storytelling. If you're interested in like video games and storytelling, there is another book that I think is worth mentioning briefly, and that is Dual Wield: The Interplay of Poetry and Video Games. And as you can tell from the title, it's bringing in some of the poetic techniques available to video games and actually the resistance to linear narrative and perhaps the paradigmatic metaphorical play that can happen if a game developer chooses to do so. There's a lot that could be said about different kinds of narrative across a range of mediums. I want to move forward though and also discuss works about narrative that also relate to the world and that interplay between the fact that literature is communicating an understanding of the world and also influenced directly by what is in the world. One work that maps that out, at least with some kind of simple layer of a starting point, would be Mimesis, the representation of reality in Western literature by Eric Auerbach. This one is not a book that's analyzing literature and what literature is doing in terms of its techniques. Instead, what you're getting here is almost a historical look at Western literature, but framed via its transformation from a prominently didactic form of just telling you what to think and influencing you and offering you various lessons toward being far more fixated on representation of the world and representing a more diverse and broader group of people. And that sort of shift in Western literature away from merely telling how to be and into showing what already is the center of what mimesis is about. And that term mimesis, you can think of it like mirroring the world, as opposed to just forming it prescriptively. The book Mimesis tries to articulate the growing importance of the everyday in literature, and also that sense of realism actually formulating our perception of what counts as the everyday. And it is a feedback loop between storytelling and the world, in the sense of storytelling gives us our sense of things we do not experience, which is the majority of what exists in the world. And it gives us that sense such that we feel as if we know the world through those stories. But then the storyteller, him or herself, is also being influenced by that world. And so there's this back and forth of constant storytelling and interpretation. And it kind of goes back to that textbook I showed earlier. We're constantly forming narratives out of sense experience, and it is an act of forming something. We're not just presenting something objectively, which is sort of like the first book, how there isn't just a means of objectively telling. You have to interpret, and sometimes you have to interpret for the reader. In that same way, this book is thinking about how books are representing what is real and how they're giving us a sense of that realism. What do we mean when we use the term realism? So it's not giving us like a dictionary generalized version of the term realism. What it instead does is offer up illustrative examples of how people have formed what counts as the real world, what is the everyday, what is ordinary, and how they're presenting it across stories in Western literature. And it would be great if you know of an example of a book that does the same with a broader range of literature across the globe. I would love to hear about that, because I don't know about a book that does that. I would love like a history of how we are interpreting the world through our stories beyond just the Western canon. But this book is a starting point by giving that side of things, that angle. Of course, it's also reminding us of the various authorial choices at play in presenting what counts as real, or presenting what even we want to pay attention to. And so there can be something revealing about those choices, because really literature represents the philosophical and ethical ideas of the time. And it can't help but do so, because that is so much of the tether that makes us care about the emotional weight of what's occurring, is how well it fits the arcs of our moral inclinations. And that could be fascinating just to think about. Literature can be a prism of various aspects of history that we can then separate out into the differing colors of its creation, like literature as a historical object, revealing something about the minds of the writers and the minds of the readers on the basis of the expectation of what the writer thought the reader would care about. The next book I know less about because I haven't read it yet, but the subject matter sounds fascinating. It's actually a book that I found within the last week at a used bookstore, and I had to buy it because on the back it has a blurb from one Steve Donahue, and that book is Philology: The Forgotten Origins of the Modern Humanities by the author James Turner. From what I understand, this is a history book of a precursor to the humanities that exists today, which is a critical analysis of literature and culture often. That field of philology or philology, I'm actually not sure how to pronounce it, seemingly was one devoted to language and the genealogy of language itself, the ways that words are an accumulation of uses across time, and those uses carry fragments of their former selves along the process of cementing into the current use of the day. From what I understand, that field of philology took language seriously and the interpretation of language seriously, and so it must surely include the use of language in speech and the use of language in storytelling and literature. In the process of explaining that history, it's also perhaps giving us an understanding of how we've come to understand interpretation, right? I imagine that it must deal with the ways that in medieval exegesis, what you're doing is you're trying to strive for some kind of cemented truth within the text, because the presumption is that there is a voice of God filtered through the language of humanity. And then because there's this belief that there's some central truth, it becomes about dissecting the text in order to reach that singular whole that has otherwise been scattered amongst the words. I wonder if it talks about that shift away from certainty in meaning toward the otherwise scattershot openness to meaning that we seemingly have, where now, at least from my memory as an English major back in the day, humanities has become much more segmented into frames of interpretation, right? You can interpret literature from different lenses, and then that becomes all perfectly agreeable within this kind of relative appreciation of a text. Now, I'm assuming what the book is going to talk about. I actually don't know, because again, I haven't read it yet, but I'm really intrigued by it. As soon as I saw it, I thought, oh man, what a perfect book for me, especially when I'm making this video. Like, this is like such an interesting way into this topic of literary interpretation and how to read and the ways that people think about language and literature, and how literature cannot escape from the confines of language. Whatever ways language can confuse or play with or illuminate meaning, the limitations and benefits within language also is gathered up in the use of that language for storytelling. And so I'm curious how this book actually deals with that. In many ways, words have that special quality of not merely being tools, but living histories that we're constantly employing. And that can feel like they're carrying within them the DNA of a line of thinking that we no longer have direct connection to, but we partake in nonetheless. And so that genealogical movement within language into stories is a curiosity for me. So I hope this book is something that is of interest to you too, just like it is for myself. And of course, it's blurbed by the great Steve Donahue, so there must be some merit to it, I would hope. There are a lot of books that I would have liked to talk about, so I just want to briefly mention that, I could have brought up the Penguin Dictionary of Literary Terms and Literary Theory. I could have brought up A History of Literary Criticism and Theory. There's quite a few Norton anthologies I could have brought into this, but I've actually talked about those in other videos. If you want more denser resources in relation to literary analysis, check out the 10 reference books video that I did and on Norton anthologies, and I think that would give you a lot more of my thoughts on interpreting literature in that particular kind of like English major way. This next book can be viewed as almost a celebration of this activity we all partake in, and that is A History of Reading. This is a particularly odd history book because it is highly personal in its framing, and what it's focused on is not that literal history of the act of reading in a rigidly chronological sense. What it's instead, it's almost like a series of separate meditations on shifts in reading and some of the importance of the act of reading. One element of reading, for instance, that this book focuses on is how literature went from being a public object, one of an orator communicating the concepts of a text to an audience, to something that is now quite private and personal. And that shift from the public to the private is a shift away from a certain kind of censorship of ideas or a certain kind of ready-made interpretation of ideas. It's a reinforcement of our capacity to interpret things on our own, figure things out for ourselves, to personalize our library, to have the library that's behind me be mine, and to have the library that's in your home be yours. And it's that element of ownership. It adds to that distinctiveness that literature offers, the inherent privacy of literature now, where we sit with a book quietly ourselves. We don't have to tell anyone what we're reading. We can work through ideas on our own, including ideas that are uncomfortable, or we can experience characters who are very much like us or completely apart, and we can appreciate them distinctively on their own merits. And we can make decisions about how to moralize or not about the characters that we read. And we can make decisions about what to value in literature. And we can have a public-facing self that communicates what we care about in what we read. And then we can have a private self that truly makes the decisions that matter to oneself about what is actually worth reading. And it's that separation between the public and private that reading has taken, that this author brings up. And he also discusses like book banning. He discusses eyeglasses and how, this little technology has offered up so many the opportunity to read at length. He covers the role of libraries and their contribution to that communal to private aspect of reading. And really, in spite of the fact that the book is in many ways quite scattered, it is continuously insightful and intriguing nonetheless. It's like you should think of it exactly as the title suggests. It's a history of reading. It's not telling you one focused history of reading. It's telling you the author's decisions about what they want to talk about in regards to reading. It's a really interesting book. I wouldn't say it's like a perfect book on reading. It really is like almost introducing aspects of reading that you can then investigate more on your own. And that is a value in itself. So it's a great starting point to think about the history of reading. Speaking of history, there are a couple books that I brought up before that I want to bring up again. The first is Lives of the Poets by Michael Smith. And by the same author, there is the novel, A Biography. What is nice about both of these is Michael Smith is an excellent writer. He writes like a poet throughout all of his prose. And he's keen in regards to his criticism of works. He doesn't just give us a view of the novels, or at least in the Western canon's history, in a distant, rigid manner. Instead, what he tries to do in both of these books in different kinds of ways, he speaks about the spread of influence and inspiration between works, between poets, and then between novels, the ways that novels are often enough in dialogue with other prior works, and they're building off of what came before. And so there's like this web of relations that he's pointing to, and then he's prioritizing the aspects of that web, not in terms of its general influence, although you're going to get a lot of the main writers and works in this biography of the novel, but he orients it in terms of his interest too. So he's giving his thoughts on these works along the way, while also quoting authors, talking about authors, quoting from the text itself. It's like a really beautiful way of mapping the history of the novel. It's not as academic as it might seem. You would assume that, you're just going to give me a general overview of what has happened and what influenced what's the Western canon, and that kind of stringent sense. And what he instead does is he offers up the basics and then also pursues his passion along the way. And like Lives of the Poets is special because it was actually the first video that I ever put up on this channel, like 2 years before I started posting regularly. And as soon as I finished reading that book, I knew I would be a fan of what Michael Smith is doing. He's highly passionate about literature, and you can feel that again and again through his descriptions of these works. It's a strange book because it is such a popular subject, a novel, just a full biography of what the novel is or has been. But what he's really toying with is the ways that the novel is never something fully delineated. It is always shifting and evolving off of itself. It's like a river that formulates its own form via its push. And so that kind of chaotic equilibrium that takes up over time is something that's so inherent to the beauty of the artistry of what literature is doing. And so I would consider both of these books wondrous ways in to the history of literature, because it is not just history in the stereotypically dry sense. It is a history of people and character and ideas building one to the next. You get that conversation of literature across time. That is probably one of the most satisfying ways to discuss this activity, which is always in conversation between a writer and a reader. That's why I would definitely recommend Michael Smith's two books. But I also want to recommend, or at least bring up, a counterpoint to both of those, and that is the work of Stephen Moore and his The Novel and Alternative History. And so there's two volumes here. So we have the beginnings to 1600, and then we have 1600 to 1800. And there is no third volume. He gives up on the idea after a while. What's worthwhile about reading the alternative history, although it is not, I wouldn't say it's as eloquent as Michael Smith's work. It's certainly not as poetic and gratifying as what Smith is doing. It instead takes a far more aggressive and contrarian view of what the novel is. It's actively seeking novel as experimentation and novel as resistance to norms and something constantly in the state of becoming itself. Stephen Moore is a critic who actively seeks provocative and unorthodox literature. And in his alternative history of the novel, he hones in on the unorthodox and provocative of literature in the past. And what's really nice about this alternative history is it's not merely just Western history. He looks at Egyptian literature, he looks at Chinese literature, he looks at Japanese literature. He's just giving us as many forms of the novel that he can find. And often he's bending the meaning of what a novel is, and you have to be accepting of that. Obviously, these things are not really traditionally considered novels. That's the point of it being an alternative history. But he is giving us an overview of what the novel could be based on what it has been. And so for that reason, I would recommend both of his alternative histories. When I think about this topic of nonfiction for fiction readers, I also consider the ways that writing is not just for entertainment, but a means of figuring things out, sometimes just for the author themselves. And it can be a struggling through a serious problem that doesn't have an easy answer, and then that gets stretched out across the span of whatever it is that's written. There's a lot of central questions that end up being a repeated struggle for many. And one of those is the idea of evil in character. The fact that some people can be so excessively cruel and wasteful and lack in the empathy that otherwise feels so obvious to so many. That distance between ourselves and some of the worst of us can be so much of the contention that literature is struggling with. Those different kinds of characters. In outlining them as characters in a story, sometimes that could be a means of trying to figure out what is this sense of the good that can be brought into the world, but also the horrifying, selfish destruction that can exist. And it makes me think of one book that isn't about literature really at all. It only brings up literature a little bit. But it is about, I guess, the question that ends up orienting some stories in literature. And that is the book Evil in Modern Thought by Susan Neiman. As I said, this isn't about literature. It's really a history of philosophy oriented around philosophers' attempts to deal with the problem of evil in the world. And that phrase, the problem of evil, is typically associated with challenges to theology. The idea being that how could God allow such evil in the world if God is all-powerful and all-knowing and so on. But this book attempts to deal with that question of the evil that persists in the world through the frame of a secular outlook. And it also includes the excesses of just horrors born of life generally. So natural disasters are included in this book. The argument that the author ends up making, whether I agree or not, is just an interesting frame, is she tries to make the case that so much of what makes evil so difficult is precisely its lack of comprehension. Not the difficulty of evil personally, because of course the thing that makes that difficult is the literal pain that you're experiencing. But from the outside, from an intellectual view, what makes evil so difficult? And her argument is that it doesn't rationally follow in so many cases. There is just a waste to it. There is something excessive and lost. It just has this feeling of incoherence with how society otherwise functions and or how we view other humans. There's a kind of trauma born of the gap between our sense of what humanity is and what actually manifests in so many humans on this planet. She uses that central argument as a boundary to then pull in various philosophers and even physicists into this question of evil in the world. I do think it's an interesting book when you want to just think about how secular philosophers have tried to deal with this concept of evil and how evil can be secularized as opposed to being some magical concept attached to notions of sin or things of that ilk. Instead, you can consider in a less God-oriented time, what is the use of that word? That is evil in modern thought. But to continue with this connection to those types of characters, that archetype of good and evil in storytelling, I also want to consider books of psychology. One that is a fairly recent release is Evil in Mind, The Psychology of Harming Others by Christopher Burris. And that one I think is worth discussing in terms of literature because it really is all about the frame around the label of evil. So he's considering not just the psychology of those who do harm, but the psychology of how we separate between those who do harm and those who don't. One of the arguments that the book ends up making is that in order to label someone as evil, we tend to stamp onto them a certain ideal type of what evil is. So a certain degree of harm and intent and actively unjustified action. As soon as the label applies, we can sometimes cut away the actual explanations at play or the actual intent involved. We sort of simplify in order to keep them within that frame. What that can lead to sometimes is like the myth of pure evil. It may be a term that you've heard. It's been brought up quite a few books. But the myth of pure evil, the idea being that if someone does something wrong, they must be essentially wrong themselves. It can't be the case that someone is just flawed or confused or lost in some way, a result of a whole range of contingent factors. Instead, there must be something essential in them. And if it's essential, it becomes unchangeable. And so it becomes like a marker of character. Once you've done certain things, it's like, okay, you must be that way. And he's not criticizing that. It's more just thinking about the ways that in order to categorize things, it's easier to keep that category consistent. And so the nuance involved with someone's actions or someone's character, it becomes harder to discuss. And that also fits into stories because a lot of the stories that are most entertaining often simplify characters in order to make for an easier bound of antagonism and the protagonist and their struggles and their desires. That bounding, that need to have contrast, can sometimes lead to simplicity in how we speak of others or how we think about what it is that other people are doing. One of the concerns that this author ends up having about this simplifying of evil is it can lead to what's called moral licensing, where because we view someone as bad, we then feel justified in doing almost anything to them, precisely because by the rules of them being bad, that implies that we therefore are good. And so then we can feel good in doing any number of harms. And those harms don't need to be direct harms. It doesn't need to be like physical attacks on the person. It could be merely social constraints that we then reinforce continuously without any means of the person escaping from that essentialism that we've placed onto them. But of course, that doesn't put the evildoer off the hook because the evil the person labeled evil, is probably also labeling others too. And that leads into another book that I think is interesting to think about. And that's this book fittingly called Evil by Roy F. Baumeister. This one is dealing directly with the psychology of the person doing the harm and the ways that they justify things in their mind. And so they are doing the very thing that the prior book was discussing, of segmenting people into groupings and then feeling justified in their actions via that segmentation. I've had experience of this when I was growing up, because I had a kind of bias about the rules that were being imposed on me from outside. It felt like kind of a privilege to be able to follow those rules. And so rather than consider the justified arguments for them, it became an insult to even consider needing to follow those rules, because I felt like, well, all that is you having the luxury of being able to live your life simply and follow these things and have everything go well for you. If I followed those same things, my life would be harder. So why would I want to follow that? It becomes this justification of, well, clearly this whole moral system is a manipulation. It's like a trick that's being played on me. And that was when I was much younger. And I do think there was a reality to that, because I did know the ways in which following certain ways of being would have actually led to things being substantially worse for me. It's interesting to think about that, the ways that there is a logic to harm. There's a way to convince yourself that harms are justified. And of course, there are plenty of flaws in that argument, and you can out-argue that position, but it doesn't change the psychological reality of what it feels like to be told that you're bad on the basis of a moral system that itself feels like it didn't include you in its creation in the first place. It didn't account for your experiences, and or it did not account for the pressures that are otherwise prominent in your psychology. This book relies on various interviews of people who have committed great harms. That obviously carries with it all sorts of potential faults, because of course someone who does harm has an incentive to present themselves as better than they actually are. And so you're going to get a little bit of that, and the author's fully aware of that. But it doesn't change that there is something to be learned from just the kind of argumentation that the person makes in regards to why they did what they did. And what ends up repeating across various people is there tends to be a moralistic language to a lot of the harms that people are doing. Sometimes what they often do is they frame themselves as the victims first, and then that leads to a great deal of harm. And it's only interesting to me because in stories, it could be very straightforward who is the good one and who is the bad one and who deserves what they get. But it makes me curious about how much harm we could be doing while thinking that we're doing good, and how much we can feel completely justified in the segmentations that we impose and the ways in which we discuss each other and things. We could be doing quite a bit of harm just in the framing of it. Not necessarily like there's a mistake in the decisions that we make in response to that framing, but just the mere framing itself of good and bad, how much of that can lead to a great deal of separation, and the separation itself can lead to other problems. Because there is a psychology involved, whether we like it or not, with good or bad people. To ignore that for the sake of the capacity to shun, I just wonder how much that is worth it sometimes. But this book also contends with the different kinds of motivations for evil behavior. So you have like instrumental evil, which is for some particular end, and you feel like, well, this is worth the cost of whatever the payout is that I want. Or there is very often egotistical evil, where the person just has a low self-esteem and they feel scarred by something in such a way that they need to make up for it in order to boost their sense of themselves, which I think we see a lot in politics, the ways that low self-esteem can lead to an extraordinary amount of harm. Then, of course, there's idealistic evil, where the person has a belief in something higher and above whatever moral constraints there are locally. And it's that superiority of the hierarchy that they have in their mind of what is the authority that superimposes over the local morality. So like someone who's religious in a fundamentalist way, such that the beliefs that they get from their religion can superimpose over whatever it is the secular rules are in the space that they're living. So that would be like an extreme example. The book also goes into the probably more obvious evil that we would be thinking of, which is sadistic evil, just the pure pleasure of enjoying hurting someone else and pushing someone down and making someone feel bad, and the pleasure and the power of that. So this book kind of covers a lot of the different ways that people frame their motivation of what it is that they're doing. But again, it's interesting because even in the case of the sadistic evil, there is a pleasure in moralization too, right? Anytime that we moralize and separate, being able to feed into our anger in regards to something having been done to us. This book tries really hard to contend with some of that psychology. And because it is based on interviews, you have to take everything with a grain of salt. But I do think the author at least is self-aware about the limits of his study. And he does try to account for that at various points. And it still can lead to at least an interesting start to a conversation about evil outside of storytelling and evil in the world as it actually exists. Of course, we can't just think about interpersonal harms. We should also think about the harms on a society-wide scale, the atrocities that consume so many. And that's when the book Humanity, A Moral History of the 20th Century by Jonathan Glover feels relevant. And this one I'll just discuss briefly, but it takes out the personal individual characters. So this is definitely a stretch in terms of nonfiction for fiction readers, but it still should be interesting to you. This one is a philosophy book, not merely just a work of psychology, although it relies on scientific research in order to make a lot of its cases, and it relies on historical research as well. And this one just covers the various atrocities throughout history. Not all of them. It uses some key case studies of mass atrocities. And it thinks about the nature of evil in terms of the distancing that we can have. It's thinking about that barrier between respect and civility and the alternative of might is right. It considers strongly some of the temptations that are born of extreme ideologies, such as utopian visions, wherein you think, if I just do this, then I can accomplish a greater good, and via that greater good, all of these atrocities are justified. And he's aware, of course, that sometimes that story is used to justify mass atrocities, but it may not necessarily be believed by those employing it. But it is that story, that utilitarian story, that he still notices again and again as having some kind of muting effect on resistance to various harms, at least long enough for those harms to occur. And when we consider distance, of course, technology and the distancing of that comes into mind. Of course, labeling and the distancing of that comes into mind. The metaphors that we use to describe people comes into mind. He's thinking about all these different things, about how it is that we can separate ourselves group-wise from others, and how that gives us that moral licensing often to destroy. There are obviously a lot more books that I could bring up, but what I'm going to do, because I've been recording this for a while, is I'm just going to put an extra list of some of the books that might be of interest to you if you enjoy fiction. So we'll have the list of all the books that I covered in this video in the description, but we'll also have some other books, and I'll link to them so that you can check them out. Yeah, maybe I'll do another video like this, but there's a lot of nonfiction that feels relevant to people who enjoy fiction. But I hope that this first video at least gives you a sense of some of the things that you can start to consider when you go back to reading that next novel, and how that novel can be brought into the world with the relevancy that it deserves. And so thank you for watching. I will see you around.